Hello. Welcome to episode 2 of Leading While Grieving. This is a monthly free masterclass series designed for those of you who are in leadership roles who are experiencing grief. Now, when I use the term leadership, I don't necessarily mean a title. I mean your ability to influence and impact the people that are around you, whether that's in a business, in your business, in the company you work for, or within your community and family. So, episode 2, we're going to focus today on how to grieve and move forward, not necessarily move on. My name is Allison Nail-Malone. I have started my career about 20 years ago in human resources and executive and leadership development and coaching. I started my own company in 2017 called Malone Consultants Group, where we have focused our efforts on ensuring that there's human resources support and leadership development has been accessible for women, for nonprofits and small businesses instead of it being a luxury. And it's been very successful. But like many people in the world, I experienced a significant loss in the time of COVID. My dad died in 2020, and he died alone because COVID prevented me from being able to be with him at his death. I was the primary caretaker, a medical decision maker for my dad. And through this experience, I was inspired to get my certification and accreditation for end of life services, such as an end of life doula. And then I went on to get my certification as a grief educator and coach with David Kessler. I then started my new business called Mysteria, and it was named after the Greek goddess of grief and sadness. Also want you to know this about me too. Throughout that loss that I experienced, it kind of pushed me to take advantage of opportunities that had always been a dream. And so one of those was since the age of 10, I'd always wanted to go to Lake McDonald, which is in Glacier National Park. The water is so clear and the rocks are all different colors. And in the background, you can see the Rocky Mountains and the Canadian border not too far. And so I was able to do this pretty much right after my dad passed. And it was really meaningful for me. Also want you to know that I am a Bigfoot and Sasquatch enthusiast. I don't know if I for sure believe he exists, but I love the community because it's weird and we all come from different backgrounds. I kind of relate this to how the grieving community is. Even though I chose to be a part of the Bigfoot Sasquatch community, we don't necessarily choose to be a part of the grieving community. But what's interesting about the Bigfoot community is that we come from all different backgrounds, all different belief systems. There's skepticism to the full-on believer. I have seen it, I have touched it, whatever. And grief is kind of the same way. It's very unexpected. We all come from different backgrounds. There's no specific kind of person that is susceptible to grief. We all are. And so that inspired me to create this monthly series to share about grief and our journey. And so during our time together today, we're going to talk a little bit about grief and loss. We're going to talk about the reality of grief and then 5 practical strategies for you as a leader to move forward with your grief instead of pushing it to the back or feeling like you, quote, have to move on. So before we get started, I would just like to invite you to just take a moment and close your eyes. If that feels safe for you, put your hand over your heart or however feels comfortable for you, and just honor who you are for watching this, for taking the time to do this, for honoring your loved one, bringing them forward. Or if you haven't lost someone significant to you, maybe there's someone in your circle that you're supporting who is experiencing grief, and just take a moment to acknowledge that grief and just send love to that person that we're missing today. I want to start this out first with this quote by David Kessler. Each person is as unique as their fingerprint, but what everyone has in common is that no matter how they grieve, they share a need for their grief to be witnessed. That doesn't mean we need someone to try to lessen it or to reframe it for us. The need is for someone to be fully present to the magnitude of their loss without trying to point out the silver lining, without trying to fix it, without trying to give any justifications. The key thing here is acknowledging that our grief is unique. It's unique to us. It's unique to the person that we lost. It's unique to the relationship of that person that we had. Had with that person. It's unique to the period of time that we're in, to the circumstances of the death or loss. And what most people haven't, when people haven't experienced a significant personal loss, is that what they don't realize is that we don't necessarily want people to fix it for us, but we just want to be witnessed. We want to be seen, and we want it witnessed in its truthfulness and its fullness. And this quote is by David Kessler, who wrote the Giving Meaning to Our Grief. Grief is transformative. Often it transforms who we are, how we think, how we relate to others, or even, the circumstances that we're in. Grief transforms the way we see and experience the world. For me, when my dad died, I had little to no patience with people. And that's not who I was before grief. The fuse of my patience was super long. And it took a lot for me to not want to deal with people, or to have anger with people, or to lose my patience with people. And then when grief hit, it almost completely got cut off. The fuse got so short. And so when this first started happening, I didn't realize until I started to process my grief and acknowledge my grief and pay attention to my grief and the healing of my grief, that's what was happening. And it's been 2 years and it still isn't, quote, back to the way it was. And I'm not sure that it ever will. But one of the benefits to this is that it has made me have better boundaries with people. To the flip side of that, I also have to watch where my energy level is. And so when I start to lose patience with people, I've got to be self-aware that that's what's happening. But here's the thing. Grief is the response to your loss. Grief is also the evidence of what we loved and that we do love. And grief has the power to transform us mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and physically. We've been taught in most societies that grief should have a timeline, and that there are these specific stages that we have to go through. And the thing is that there is no timeline to grief. In our society, we think that there's these specific stages to go through, that we knock it out, that we accomplish it, and then we're done. But the reality is that is absolutely not the case. I recently read this book, Winter Counts, by David Huska Wandley Whedon. He is an Indigenous author, and he wrote that the main character of the book was visiting the burial site of his family, specifically his sister, and said, everyone said that grief would get better over time, but that hasn't happened. What I discovered was that sadness is like an abandoned car left out in the field for good. It changes a little over the years, but it never disappears. You may forget about it for a while, and it's still there, resting away until you notice it again. And this gives the reality of grief, that it doesn't move around in these specific stages. And those of us who are overachievers, high performers, and perfectionists, that's what we want, because we feel like that's certainty. But the reality of is all this scribble scrabble over here. It doesn't move in stages, and it moves all around. And the one moment you think you've moved towards acceptance and you're no longer searching for them, and then tomorrow you wake up and you're angry about the death, you're angry about the circumstances, you're even angry about how you feel. And this is completely normal. It's also very healthy. It's hard for our brains and our hearts to comprehend the randomness of grief. Even when, I knew my dad his health was declining, we were given a certain amount of time that he was going to, live or until his death would imminently happen, but it was still random when he died. And so our grief can't move in stages because it is so random. And the reality is that sometimes it's a damn mess and that sometimes it's completely calm and it's fine. And kind of bringing back into the leadership aspect of this. And when I say leadership, I mean that many of you are part of companies or businesses, but maybe you lead projects or community initiatives, or that you take care and lead your family. All of these are relevant leadership roles. Is that so much of leadership is about pushing and overcoming. We cast this vision, we solve the problems, we energize others, and we move those goals forward. We set the goal, we make the action plan, we work on it, we hold ourselves accountable, we stick to the plan, and then we achieve the goal and success. And we have been ingrained in us to do the same thing about grief. How many of us have heard the idea? We've either said it ourselves or we said it to ourselves or someone has said to us, it's been 3 months. Why are you still talking about it? It's been 2 years. Why are you still crying about it? Or that it happened so long ago. I'm surprised you aren't over it. And so I'm wondering if this relates to you. But grief is the opposite. It's about sitting and staying with our difficult emotions until they work through our heart and our body deeply and passively. In some ways, grief is exactly the opposite of the leadership mindset we've been taught. And in this time when people are focused on goals, moving forward, setting expectations, or have their one word for the year, and when everyone is navigating at least one kind of loss or another, I'm finding that many leaders aren't sure how to both lead and grieve at the same time. Some are kind of choosing one extreme over the other. They're either quitting their jobs or they're living in denial. But you don't have to choose. It's possible to navigate both leading and grieving in healthy, healing, and productive ways. And so in a moment, not right now, we're going to talk about carrying grief and joy in the same basket, in the same life, and even in the same day. There's freedom in knowing that you can carry both grief and joy together. So here are the 5 strategies to support you as a leader while grieving or when you do grieve. So before we dive into these, I'm just going to invite you to listen to all of these, but only choose one for now that resonates the most with you, because grief takes time. And that also means we move with our grief one step at a time and not be the overachiever. I'm raising my hand here, and to get over your grief. So number 1 is to give yourself permission to grieve and adjust your expectations. Sometimes it is hard to admit that we've lost something important to us, especially if it's a secondary or cumulative loss. Our culture doesn't acknowledge that well. So an example of a secondary loss is when I lost my dad. Prior to losing my dad, I was the primary caretaker. I made all the decisions. It took a lot of time, energy, patience, days, decision making. I had this role. And when he died, I no longer had that role. I had this space of time and energy I didn't know what to do with. And so I was grieving that secondary loss, that role, that identity that I had with that. And it really requires courage to admit our vulnerabilities, which can be especially difficult for leaders who are encouraged not to appear weak or vulnerable. And grief requires a lot of time and a lot of energy. Think of grief as taking on a temporary side job. It won't last forever, but while you are in it, you will need to adjust some of the things like the busyness of your schedule or how aggressive your goals are, making sure that you give yourself extra space, both emotionally and even professionally, to process your loss. Remember, you will be back, but it will be a new reality. Because the truth of the matter is that we were made to heal. If you give yourself the permission and the opportunity to work through your grief, you will be back stronger and the investment will pay off because grief is not wasted time. It's invested time. Grief is not wasted time. It's invested time. The second strategy is to embrace both the waves of grief and the waves of productivity because grief can be unpredictable. But the good news here is that grief is predictably unpredictable. Sadness, difficulty concentrating, fatigue, anger, or any other signs of grief tends to come in waves. You will need to embrace the waves and take time to feel those feelings or those waves. Once you've done that, the wave will pass and you'll feel much better. If the wave hits you at a time when you aren't free to feel those feelings, maybe at work or in a group of people, you can sometimes delay them for a few minutes or an hour or even a day, but resist the urge to avoid them completely. The closer you are to the loss, the less likely you are to be able to hold back your emotions. And because this is just totally normal. If you're early in the process, take the time off that you need to let your emotions flow when they need to. Once a grief wave has worked its way through, it's usually followed by a wave of feeling somewhat normal and maybe even a little bit tired. And then you'll have a wave that comes where you have some energy and mental clarity. That's the time to get stuff done. But be kind to yourself. And to start with those small tasks that you can easily put down if another wave unexpectedly comes. Be sure to give yourself a daily routine with chunks of time that you can engage with your productivity and times when you take a break, when you have a chance to feel what you need to feel. And depending on your schedule, these grief spaces may be between meetings, taking your lunch break in your car where you can have some privacy, or just leaving your evenings and weekends more open to process your grief. You may even keep a to-do list close by. When you get a sense of some energy, get busy with the things that keep your life and your leadership moving forward. And as you go, you'll begin to see the waves when they tend to hit. Eventually, the waves will become smaller and further apart, and you'll find yourself getting more and more done. That's the sign of some healing starting to happen. Number 3 is to make sure that you're communicating with your team or your community and eliminating what you can. Take a moment and think through what's absolutely necessary for you to perform your job or your role over the next 2 to 3 months, especially if your grief is less than a year old. Chances are good that there are a lot of things that are important, but not critical. So this is a great opportunity for you to delegate, eliminate, or delay what you can for now to give yourself the time and the space you need. This is something that I'm still learning to do. Recently, I was at a leadership retreat, and one of the things that I learned is that I needed to give myself the permission to lean into my people. I know intellectually I have a group of people that if I called, if I texted them that I needed help and support, they would be there in a minute. But as someone who has been a caretaker, an overachiever, a perfectionist, I'm driven, I go do things. It's hard for me to communicate with my people that I need support. So if you're managing a team, inform your team that maybe you're not going to be at your peak performance for a while, but they can still count on you to lead them well. Depending on your work culture, you may or may not want to go into a lot of detail, but clearly articulating you're going to be focused on what you're going to be focused on for the next couple of months and what you're going to do with your other responsibilities is the key to keeping your team moving forward. Remember that limitations on leaders are oftentimes when the team grows and shines the most. So don't be afraid to give your team members big responsibilities and see how they do. Trust the timing of your grief could be exactly the developmental opportunity to bring out the best in people. And when your people get better, you all win. When you lean into your community of people, it gives them the opportunity to be of service and also to show their appreciation and honor for you when you say, yes, I need your help. And when you feel like you can't say no, try saying, just not right now. Number 4 is to take one day at a time and practice healthy self-care. And I use that term practice on purpose. We have to strengthen that muscle because taking care of yourself is not selfish. It's good stewardship of who we are as human beings, especially in times of grief. When we don't deal with our loss early on, it grows back and it becomes bigger. And that's the best time to lean in and work the process because grief is like a baby that needs your attention. It wants it now and it needs a lot of attention. And when it doesn't get paid attention to, it's going to cry louder. So don't rush yourself. Take one day at a time because each day is going to be different. So if you're feeling good today, embrace it and enjoy it. If you feel particularly sad and overwhelmed, cancel what you can, or even take a mental health day if that's accessible for you. Access the support you need. It might be working through a good book on grief. I'll be sharing some resources in a minute. It may be going to a grief support group. Many hospice centers, even if you and your family weren't patients at that hospice center, they have grief support groups that you can attend and be a part of for free, even if you didn't use their services. It might be a meeting weekly or monthly with a therapist. Continue to communicate and set the tone for your team. Communicate to your community of people what you need. Your team, your kids, your friends, they're all watching and they want to support you. You may need to adjust your social media. I know for me, social media actually helps me, but I have to limit my time. I've curated lists of people who are going through grief so that I know like there's other people like me out there. And then I also have a curated list of funny dogs. But for some people, scrolling through mindlessly and seeing how everyone else is happy can be detrimental. So take the time to get what you need out of social media and then let it go. And just another way to practice self-care is just to be gently active. If you're not an active person, maybe this is not the ideal time to train for a marathon, but maybe you go out for a jog or a walk outside, or go shoot some hoops with somebody that you care that you have a great relationship with. Just be gentle with yourself. You may want to nurture some of your spiritual practices or your religious practices. If you're not particularly spiritual or religious, like how can you practice mindfulness in the day that would, or things that would bring you peace and joy? Remember when you were 10 years old and you played with Transformers or Barbies or coloring or roller skating? Maybe invite that back in and see how that might bring you some joy. But just listen to what made you happy, what evokes emotions, like listening to music or maybe attending a church service or spiritual breathing or just a mindfulness practice of what's happening outside for you. And number 5 is to notice when you begin to dream again. Um, what I think is beautiful about this is there are moments when you know, especially when grief is new, it's hard for us to dream and be hopeful of the future, really see what's happening around us. But there'll be these little moments where you'll be like, oh wow, this food tastes really good right now. Or you wake up in the morning, you look out the window and you're like, oh my gosh, that sunrise is gorgeous. Or you're warming up your car outside because today in this moment it's winter and the frost is happening and you're warming up your car and you're sitting out, you're waiting for that, but you can hear the birds outside. Or maybe you feel a little happiness in the moment. You know, document this when you're experiencing it, because one of the signs that you're moving towards healing is that dreaming of a hopeful future again. I'm not talking about the drive of avoidance or forcing, quote, meaning out of your loss. And it's important to do that, but not to force it. But you'll notice that when there's ideas coming back, your creativity starts to percolate again, write down these ideas. It may not be the exact time to act on them yet, but when you start to experience those waves of productivity, maybe tapping into those things that make you dream again. You know, having ideas and keeping them alive for the future is a great use of this time. When you find yourself going days or weeks without these big waves of grief, you will know it's time that you've started to move from grieving to dreaming of the future and planning for it. And when that time comes, you'll start to feel that sustainable energy, hope, and excitement that will naturally flow through your heart and even in the moments of grief. And just know that it is possible to navigate both leading and grieving in healthy, healing, and productive ways, but also know that it is okay to not be okay. It's okay for some of those days to find joy and happiness. Grief has no timeline and it will feel like it comes from nowhere. And know that when you have a good day, it doesn't mean that you have forgotten your loved one. In fact, it's a really beautiful way to honor your connection with that person. So we've talked about a little bit about what grief is, the reality of grief. We've talked about these 5 stages of grief, of giving yourself permission to grieve and adjust your expectations, to embrace the waves of grief and productivity, to communicate with your community and eliminate what you can, to take one moment at a time and to notice when you dream again. And just remember that all of this takes time to adjust to your new normal. So that's why I say just choose one thing to move you forward. And to remember that you're not alone. There's other people who are grieving in the world, even though it feels like a very lonely path and a lonely journey. These are just some of those resources that you can tap into. Is grief.com. There's a ton of free resources. There's also subscription-based support groups provided by David Kessler and also led by David Kessler at grief.com. I mentioned there are hospice groups that provide free support groups. So a really great book that I recommend is It's Okay That You're Not Okay. She also just came out with a journal. Also, there is the book called Grief is Love, which was also a beautiful experience about what grief is and utilizing language that gives words to what we're feeling and thinking. And then a really wonderful podcast called Grief Out Loud podcast is a really great support. So I'll also am happy to share free and low cost resources that you can use to support you during your grieving journey. In February of 2023, I'll also be starting a group coaching program called Leading While Grieving, Moving from Grief to Relief. And I'm happy to share that with you in a moment. So if for just this moment, what did you find most meaningful? What resonated with you, and just what's that one thing? Because there's a lot of information that I gave you. We talked about what grief is, what it isn't, the reality of grief, and then just 5 strategies and just choosing one. Which of those resonated most with you? What statement did I share that really kind of got you in the heart and gut? And I encourage you to write that down. So I want to thank you for spending the time, for listening, for watching this. Maybe this is the first time you've watched it, or maybe this is a replay for you the second time and you attended the live version. I'll encourage you that each month I'll be doing a different episode. And I do not record those because when people are here with me live, I want it to be a safe environment and a sacred space for everybody to show up authentically and to share authentically. And so these are pre-recorded for us to share. But when I do these monthly sessions live, they are not recorded. And so if you would like to learn more about grief support, about the coaching that I provide or the end of life services that I provide, or the upcoming program of Leading While Grieving, Moving from Grief to Relief, this is my text number. You can text me there. You can email me here as well. You can also check out my website here at mymasseria.com/grieving-leaders. Thank you so much for being present today. I honor you, I acknowledge you, and I will hold space for you today. And I'm grateful for you for taking this time to honor your grieving journey, your heart, and your emotions through this. Thank you so much, and I look forward to connecting with you soon.